Okay, so a little bit about 6waves. So we are entering into our 10th anniversary next year. And we started the company actually doing a lot of Facebook games publishing. So we work with a lot of Russian partners before, such as Game Insight, Playrix, even Visor. We've been actually helping them to bring their game and localize them on the Facebook platform when we started the company. And we're in a way still doing that by helping developers to bring users from different parts of the world to their games. But now we're shift to mobile platforms. So right now we have 6 offices. The company's headquarters in Hong Kong. This is where I'm from. But we also have offices in Japan, Taiwan, Seoul, Beijing, and also in San Francisco. We have about 160 employees over the world. And as of now, we have about over 300 games published. And we have about over 3 million fans on Facebook. And in terms of just mobile installations, we already have over 33 million. Thank you. So Roppongi. So for those who've been to Japan, this is a place where it's actually famous for bars. And this is where our office is located. Not only because we want to have a drink after work, but it's also very close to the Google and also the Apple office, where we actually have to meet up with them pretty much every month to talk about our new games. So why Japan? Right? So Japan is a very big market, but in a way it's also very foreign. It's also hard to penetrate. So why do we actually decided to go into Japan? So of course, it's a big market. So according to Newzoo, Japan is actually the number 2 largest market in the world. Console games are a huge part, but also the mobile revenues is actually more than console already. So it's estimated to be $6.7 billion US dollars in just this year alone. Also, it has a very large mobile gaming market, as I just mentioned. So again, this is the information coming from Newzoo. So it's only second behind China, and it's actually even a bigger market than the United States. Another thing about the Japanese market is that the mobile gaming penetration is actually one of the highest in the world, of course, because of the high-end mobile phones and also very good connectivity. So if you look at the penetration at almost 63%, it's actually way higher than the number 2 US at only 40%. Now, that's the good part, right? A lot of people are already using mobile phones and playing games on their mobile phones. But on the flip side, the challenge is, because of the penetration is already that high, the growth of more mobile games is actually maybe not as fast as some of the other markets. So that's the flip side of having such a high penetration. But there's one good thing about the Japanese users. So if you look at these Japanese users, these numbers, actually 61% of them actually spend money in games. So again, on the mobile platforms, the most common way of charging users is in-app purchase. So freemium is still the most popular category of mobile games in Japan. But the good thing about Japan is that a lot of users are very willing to pay when playing their games. So to summarize, I think one big reason is why Japanese market is so attractive to a lot of developers and also to us at 6waves is that the user behavior is actually very good for companies like us. High pay ratio, high opt-out, and also high loyalty. So I'm going to show you a few more slides to prove these points. So Uncle Ben of Spider-Man once said, with great power comes great responsibility. So what I would say about the Japanese users is, with high opt-out comes high expectations. All right, yes, so they do pay a lot more. So according to some of our own experience, for the same game published in Japan versus in Taiwan and Hong Kong, the opt-out in Japan is usually about 20 to 30% even higher for like markets like Hong Kong and Taiwan. And for games that we publish in the US too, similar, depending on different genre. Sometimes we see the outbound in Japan is actually 10 to even 20, 30% higher than in the US. So it's a very, very good market, but then the user expectations is very high. So one of the things when they play mobile games is that they really expect the games to be bug-free, 100%. So for that, as a developer and also as a publisher, when you bring it to Japan, you really have to test it out. You have to do a lot of testing before you launch it. One of the challenge for the Japanese market, as opposed to, for example, English market, is that you cannot find a small country to test it out first. For example, if you launch it in US, most of the developers will pick, for example, Canada or Singapore to test out the market first, right? To make sure that you get the user feedback and improve the game. But the challenge for Japanese game is that there's no other Japanese smaller market that you can push it out first. I mean, you can still do closed beta testing, or you can put it to Google for early access to test out the game. But to do a closed or open beta test, that may not be possible. So you just have to make sure that your game is very, very smooth, and you test it out before you launch it in Japan. Local devices. So Japan is still a little bit more Android-based country. So I think in terms of units, Android devices maybe about 60-65% versus Apple. But then there's also a lot of local devices in Japan. Sony devices are actually very popular. Of course, you also have your Samsung, but Samsung's, most of the developers are actually, they will test the game on Samsung. But for Japan, what we found before is that there are a lot of users using Sony devices, which sometimes have their own unique issues when we launch games. So that's another challenge when you bring games into Japan. Responsive customer service. I think the Japanese audience, while they have like high ARPDAU, they're also being spoiled. They usually have very responsive customer service when they ask the questions. Not just from the gaming industry, but for a lot of other industries. So that's why they're having such a high expectations. And the last one is live events. So for the best games, they regularly have a lot of events going on within the game. Not only weekly events, sometimes they have 2 or 3 concurrent events going on in the same week, trying to target different segments of users. So they do have a lot of expectations in terms of live events in the game. So I mentioned about loyalty of one of the key advantage of kind of like addressing your market to the Japanese users. So in terms of loyalty, what I did is that I looked at App Annie report, and I kind of like took a snapshot in the top grossing games. So in 2015, so these are the 5 top grossing games in Japan. So I think you probably recognize some of them. Big Sea Monster Strike, Gung Ho's Puzzle and Dragon, and Sum. And then 1 year later, these are the 5 most popular games. So you got some newcomers like Fate Grand Order. This is earlier this year, and this is like a week ago. So what you notice is that there are some games that are consistently in the top 5 grossing, and these are being highlighted in the red squares. One of which, of course, is Monster Strike. After all these years, it's still very popular. It still generates a lot of revenue from the company. Users are still very willing to not just only play the game, but pay for the game, because again, this is top grossing. Also, Puzzle and Dragon is still there, and then you also have Fate Grand Order. So Japanese users, if you are able to serve them well, they tend to be very, very loyal. So that's a good point if you're a mixie. But of course, the challenge is if you're a newcomer, how do you actually kind of like present your game to these users when they have actually been so loyal? So again, you have to differentiate your game in order to actually get their attention. So what about overseas games to Japan? So how is the Japanese market being very responsive to non-Japanese developed games? So again, I look at Yuzu, and I took at the top grossing games. From the top 10, 9 of them is actually from Japan. So again, most of the games that people play are made locally. If you're going down to the top 20, 17 out of 20 is actually from Japan. And then you also have like one from China and one from US. Looking down to the top 50, slightly a little bit better, including 2 games from Russia. So these 2 games are actually all both from Playrix, being Garner's games and also Holmes games. And then if you look at top 100, there's a little bit more, a few more from China, and then you also have like from Finland, Sweden, 2 from Hong Kong and Taiwan. So, again, 75% of the top 100 most top grossing games are actually developed locally. So, I think if you compare to bigger regions like the US, that's actually still very locally dominant. But if you compare to China, I think China is actually even have a higher number. So I mean, Japan, yeah, maybe while it's challenging, but at least they are actually a little bit more open to foreign developed games. So as a percentage, again, so this is earlier this year. When I look at the top 10 grossing games, all of them are actually from Japan. All right. So compared to just like last week, so it looks like they're opening up a little bit. If you look at top 50, it's the same percentage. But if you look at top 100, it's a little bit more now. 25% is actually overseas games. All right. So you thought, yeah, it's maybe moving to a little bit more towards like non-Japanese developed games, but still, it doesn't really move much, right? Now, if I compare this to 2014, you see how the market has changed, right? Like from 3 years ago, it's almost like if you're an overseas game, there's like almost no chance to crack in the top 100. But now, as you can see, I think number one, I think the users definitely are a lot more receptive to different type of gameplay and style. And number two, more importantly, I think as developers are spending more effort and focus in trying to bring their games into the Japanese market, they are doing a lot more better job on localizing the game, culturalizing the game, and also doing local help, with marketing and customer service and live ops. So you can see that the market is actually opening up for a lot more overseas developers. So now that you kind of convinced that these numbers are actually good, that Japan is actually a big market and it's getting more opening up to the Western developers. So what are your kind of like key to success in Japan? So I'm just going to share with some of our previous experience on what we've done to make games like really being popular in Japan. So one of the games that I want to mention is a game called Age of Three Kingdoms. This is a game actually developed in China, but we spent a lot of time to localize the game into Japanese, and then we launched it in Japan for about 2 years ago already. And it's been like a top 50 grossing game, and the highest average on was actually a top 20 position that we actually reached in terms of top grossing on iOS. So I divided that into kind of like 3 phases. When we launch a game, there's like a lot of things that you have to do pre-launch, and then during launch, and then post-launch. So I'll start with the pre-launch stage first. So of course, localization, right? I mean, text is really the most straightforward thing that you have to think about when you bring your games into Japan or any other foreign countries. But then don't underestimate the importance of this. Sometimes when your text get localized or translated in the wrong way, especially not really within the game context, the users can tell, and they will immediately know that this is really not a really good quality game. But sometimes the game mechanics has nothing to do with the text. So what I suggest is that you really work with partners who actually do well. And what we also do, we sometimes get another company or our in-house language specialist to do another kind of like round of checking before we actually launch the game. And also sometimes you have to localize the graphics. Really, certain graphics work well. I think you look at Supercell's game that are actually very popular in Japan too. Those type of graphics are relatively universal, that works well. For Asian developers, they're also maybe a little bit easier to get kind of like accepted by Japanese users. But then this is an example that's actually done by Chinese developers. So Chinese developers have their very different style. Colors are a lot more brighter with a high contrast, where The Japanese users, they tend to go a little bit lighter in terms of color and style. So this is just one of the example. You also have to think about localizing certain graphics. And then voice. I think voice in particular, character's voice is very important in China. In Japan. There are actually voice actors and actresses that are actually celebrities. I think people would actually recognize the names, and when you say, well, so and so is actually involved in being a voice actress in the game, it's actually one of the key marketing points. So this is one of the games that we've done. We actually include getting kind of like signed autographs from these voice actresses. And when we launch the game, we kind of like do a live ops and events where, top spenders can actually get an autograph from these voice actresses, and the users really like it. So again, these voice actors and actresses are actually very popular, and because of that, you usually need to actually book someone like 2 to 3 months advance in order for them to actually work on your game. Pre-registration is also very, very popular and important in Japan. In particular, I think for pre-registration, you'll be able to get people who are really interested in your game. And typically when you pre-register users, the conversion rate is much higher than when you launch the game and do other types of promotion. So pre-registration, including giving them some special items that may not be available or may not be available for just kind of like paying money to buy, that is actually very popular in Japan. Now, what about the launch stage, right? So when we launch the game, we do a lot of online performance-based marketing. That is actually very, very popular and effective in Japan. Again, because I think Japan is a highly penetrated country, and there are actually a lot of networks out there that has been very sophisticated that allow you to target particular users that may actually like your game. So do a lot of online performance-based marketing. But what's also very important in Japan or in a lot of Asian countries or cities is offline. It's also very, very important. One of the key reasons is that, for example, Tokyo is a very densely populated city. There's over 13 million in terms of population in Tokyo. So because of the density, offline marketing works quite well, including your signage, stations and buses and whatnot. So some of the things that we've done for the game, including that we've had this kind of like super big billboard in Shinjuku subway station in Tokyo. This is one of the busiest subway stations in the world, and we find that to be very effective. Now, of course, when we do this offline campaign, we usually do not just do offline alone. We usually do it with offline and online combined together, and we usually see the lift of additional installs that we get because we do an offline campaign. It's actually quite effective. So this is how we do it when we're actually kind of like launching the game. So we usually launch the game with just pure online marketing, and we get some initial metrics, make sure the game is actually smooth, there's no kind of like critical bugs. And usually when we get the metrics and we feel that this game is actually going to be very good and popular, usually it takes about a month or two, then we will launch another campaign with both offline and online. So usually just pure online first, and then combine online with offline again, about 1 to 2 months. For this game, we also do a TV commercial. Again, we actually pick certain period, usually late at night, where our gamers would turn on the TV while playing game. So that's actually how we reach the target audience. YouTubers and influencers, again, it's very, very effective channel in Japan. They can really actually make a big difference in terms of helping your users to think about whether this game is actually a good game or not. And there's also TV game shows. So traditional terrestrial TV stations, they have actually game shows, and they would actually, these are actually very popular hosts of that TV game show, and they will actually invite celebrities or just other kind of like normal game players to go to the show and talk about the games. And this is a little bit more creative. So we actually partner up with a retail chain store called Big Camera. So they are one of the biggest electronics retail store in Japan, and we asked them to see if we can put our TV ad on their TV displays, and we can't reach a deal with that. And it's actually a very effective use of their space too, because otherwise they were just playing some normal programs, but we're able to actually manage to get our ads in front of the TV, on the TV panels in their retail stores. So we find that to be actually with a high recall rate when we ask about the users. So post-launch. So mentioned earlier, live operations is very important, and that's actually one of the key to improve your retention, and also more importantly, the monetization of the games. So we have a very detailed, not just us, I think all of the games that you saw earlier on the top grossing chart, they had a very kind of like a sophisticated kind of like scheduling of all the live operation events, and the Japanese users don't really see that as kind of like too bothering or too busy. They can't expect that. So we really have to schedule all these live events and make sure that there's a lot of things going on and happening in the game. And also the forums, user forums, and also we have Twitter account, Facebook accounts for each individual games, where they would be very active in terms of kind of like giving us feedback, giving us suggestions. Also sometimes they complain about the game or complain about other users. So we have to actually actively monitor all these user forums. And then last of all, there's like a very big Tokyo game show that happens in every September. So we usually would participate in these game shows, and there's like hundreds of thousands of users who come during that 4-day event, lining up, getting photographs and premium items. Again, we find that to be very effective, not just to get additional users into the game, but more about retention and giving the image that the company is investing into the game, so it has to be a good game. So I think these perceptions are still very important when it comes to the Japanese users. So that's basically my sharing on the Japanese market. And here's my contact in case you want to reach out, and if you have any additional questions that you might have in the future, but I know that we might have some time right now for Q&A session. Thank you.
Arthur Chow, the CEO of the 6waves. So, guys, do we have questions? Господа, если у кого-то проблемы с английским, я буду рад помочь с переводом. Здесь стоит микрофон, к нему можно выходить и задавать все свои вопросы. Серьезно? Нет вопросов по выходу на рынок Японии?
No questions. Everybody's ready for Japan.
Yeah, I guess everyone is, still digesting the information, so I'll be the first. So Arthur, you showed the really good slides about the overseas games in Japan. So, and as the local games are dominating the market, what is your opinion on actually why? So, is it like the issue of the game design, because Japanese game design is somehow different from the, let's say, Western? Or it's the problem of the adaptation, localization, the culturalization, and all the kind of things?
I think it's both. I think, of course, you see some of the Japanese games are so popular because they are also with Japanese IP. So they have like traditional, maybe gaming IP they play on console before. They're now available on mobile. It could be animation or cartoon or mangas IP that they are familiar with. So in those cases, you cannot compete with that because they have an IP. But again, as you can see, there are actually more overseas games going to Japan. I think they're more willing to try different styles of gameplay. So before, most of the Japanese games are RPG type games, some action games, and also sports also quite popular. If it's like football or baseball, they're also quite popular in terms of grossing, but I think they're more open up to different type of gameplay. So I quote an example, but this is actually not on mobile. This is on Facebook social platform. We worked with Game Insight about 5-6 years ago, and we brought a hidden object game into Japan. It's called Mystery Manor. So before that, there's no hidden object game in Japan. But that game became like really popular, and now there's actually a lot more hidden object game going into the market. So I think the Japanese market are now, or the users are now willing to try new different genre of games, but then the game has to be localized well, in terms of of course the language again, but also the way you actually do your events and your gacha systems and have the things that they're actually more familiar with. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Появились ли вопросы? Ну, выходите сюда. Тут да, стойка.
Thank you for the presentation.
Yeah.
Could you please share with us the scale of marketing budget of those three stages, pre-launch, launch, and post-launch? Because I see it's huge.
Yes, yes.
What's the scale?
Right, good question. So we usually start for pre-registration. It depends on the genre of the game. So you see the games that we do is more about mid-core to hardcore. So we're not trying to get a lot of users. We're trying to get quality users. So it's not mass market or casual games. So for our type of games, during pre-registration, you spend anywhere from 20, 50,000 to maybe a bit more US to get pre-registered users. Now during launch, then we usually do a stage approach, right? But typically you spend about 50 to 100,000 just to get, I'll say at least 50,000 to get a good sample size into the game and see whether it works. Now if the game is good, then you move on to do offline your TV and your posters and your billboard. That could be like around like 2-3 million US. So that's why we take a step-by-step approach. We don't want to kind of there are actually developers or games that are very aggressive. For example, if they are actually already popular elsewhere, I think Candy Crush, when they launched in Japan, they did a pretty big campaign right at the start. So there are actually game developers who do that. But we want to take a more pragmatic approach and measured approach to make sure that the game is doing well before we actually spend all the offline marketing dollars.
Thank you very much, Arthur. I guess we have time for one more question. Еще один вопросик.
Thank you. Is your experience specific to mobile games? Do you know any difference between mobile, social games, consoles, PC, specific to Japan market, comparing to Western?
Right. I think, in a way, it's quite similar. I mean, mobile, typically the play session will be very short. And one thing is that in Japan, right, because the land is so expensive, the property is so expensive, a lot of people, when they go to work, they spend over 1 or 2 hours one way to go to work. They live very far away. So and in the subway, they cannot use their phone to talk. They have to put it on mute. So what they do, they look into their phone, right? Sometimes they communicate using Line, but most of the time they play games. So that's why in general the sessions, because it's mobile, is relatively short compared to social or compared to console. But then in Japan, it still can be relatively long just because they commute for long periods of time. The other thing is actually quite unique to Japan is that a lot of games are on portrait mode instead of landscape. So imagine if you're stuck in a very crowded subway, one hand you have to use to hold on to the rail, and then you just use one hand to actually play a game. So there's a lot of design in games in Japan that are actually mostly portrait. But I think I see there's a trend that's actually more landscape games are actually also doing well. So, but it's just that one characteristics in Japan that may be different when you compare to the West, when most people, they drive to work, and then they don't really then spend too much time in commuting. So I think that's one of the key differences. But otherwise, typically mobile, short periods of time compared to kind of console, longer period of time. Play.